By 1865, 4 years of grueling combat had settled two massive questions. The United States would not be divided, and the institution of slavery was destroyed. The Union Army had achieved absolute military dominance. Yet the surrender at Appomattox was only a starting point. It would take over a dozen more years to figure out exactly what that battlefield victory translated to in peacetime. Whatever post-war plans existed were thrown into chaos exactly 1 week after Robert E. Lee surrendered, when President Abraham Lincoln was murdered. His sudden absence left a fractured nation facing massive structural problems. The government had to figure out how to fold millions of newly freed citizens into American society, how to readmit the rebellious states, and how to repair the deep psychological wounds between the North and the South. An army can force a surrender, but if the victors don't agree on what society should look like the day after, the peace they won is incredibly fragile. This fragility became obvious very quickly. As late as 1867, 2 years after the guns went quiet, Washington still had no coherent policy for rebuilding the South. Instead of implementing a plan, Northern politicians spent their energy fighting each other. The Republican-led Congress locked into a bitter power struggle with the new president, Andrew Johnson. Even when a legislative faction known as the Radical Republicans tried to take the reins and force a thorough Reconstruction process, they couldn't hold on to power long enough to see it through. Because the North couldn't agree on a singular direction, the physical and political rebuilding of the defeated states was left half-finished. This delay gave the old Southern power structures the exact breathing room they needed to organize. An early push to industrialize the region and create a new South ultimately stalled. Well past 1877, the region remained heavily reliant on troubled plantations growing cotton, rice, and tobacco. In this stagnant economy, newly freed Black Americans had initially managed to carve out a foothold and start building independent lives. But as Washington began to look away, they were increasingly left to fend for themselves. While the Northern politicians who claimed to champion their rights were divided and distracted, Southern whites were achieving absolute political alignment. They agreed on one primary objective: Southern blacks must be kept poor, stripped of their voting rights, and kept entirely under white control. This is where the balance of power shifted. A disorganized victor, no matter how strong their military, can easily be outmaneuvered by a defeated population that shares a single, unyielding goal. On paper, the 14th and 15th Amendments were designed as legal pillars to guarantee citizenship and voting rights for freedmen. But Southern legislatures engineered a complex web of local statutes, Jim Crow laws, to deliberately bypass those guarantees, legally segregating society and erecting impossible barriers. And these local laws weren't enforced just by the police. They were backed by a systemic campaign of white terror and violence directed at Black communities. By combining localized legal loopholes with unchecked vigilante violence, Southern leaders effectively neutralized the highest laws in the nation. Confronted with this organized resistance, the federal government blinked. Their response to the rising tide of Southern violence was weak and inconsistent. Northern resolve was rapidly draining away, sapped by a string of political scandals, weak presidential leadership, and a public that had simply grown tired of hearing about the problems in the South. Eventually, the government and the broader Northern public made a conscious choice to turn their backs. They walked away from Reconstruction, leaving it as an unfinished task. Millions of Black Americans were left entirely defenseless against a mature, legally entrenched system of racial segregation, designed specifically to trap them at the bottom of the social order. A law written on a piece of paper offers no protection if the government lacks the moral stamina to actually enforce it. The Union Army achieved a total military triumph in just 4 years of fighting, but over the next few decades, almost every political objective they fought for collapsed. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Southern states had successfully written a highly effective system of racial oppression directly into their local constitutions. For the African Americans living through this era, facing systemic disenfranchisement and constant physical threat, it was entirely reasonable to look around and wonder who had actually won the Civil War. The North conquered the battlefield. But by abandoning the hard work of the peace, they handed the defeated South the power to write the rules for the next century.